Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this Intelligence Squared debate on the motion, Karl Marx was right. Capitalism post-2008 is falling apart under the weight of its own contradictions. Since the collapse of the Western banking system in 2007 to 2009, the advanced industrial economies have struggled to recover in spite of highly unorthodox measures, huge monetary stimulus, and yet the constraints of high public debt and anemic growth have proved as yet almost insurmountable. Is this an illustration of the inherent contradictions of capitalism, the immiseration of the proletariat, the rate of the profit, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall? Or are we instead seeing some exceptional event brought about not by the contradictions of capitalism, but by the failure of one particular segment of the economy, the financial system, and at the same time seeing the productive power of the market in other parts of the world, notably China? As you came into the hall, you will have been asked your initial view. After hearing the speeches from our distinguished panel, you will be asked to vote on the motion in front of you. You have a ticket with for or against. When it comes to the vote, you'll have a ballot box passed along the rows in front of you. If you wish to vote for the motion, you put the side of it with for in the box, against, put against in the box. If you are undecided, please put the whole voting card into the box. The motion, or the proponents of the motion will speak first. The motion again, Karl Marx was right, capitalism post-2008 is falling apart under the weight of its own contradictions. The speaker who's going to introduce that motion is Tristram Hunt, historian, Labour MP, and author of a biography of Friedrich Engels. Please welcome Tristram Hunt. Tristram, your time starts now.
Oliver, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, in July 1851, Friedrich Engels, the Manchester cotton lord and co-author of the Manifesto of the Communist Party, wrote to his friend Karl Marx in London with some very promising news. Speculation in railways is again reaching dazzling heights. Since the 1st of January, most shares have risen by 40%, and the worst ones more than any. This is promising. Clearly, capitalism's denouement was just around the corner. The East India market was overstocked, while the British cloth industry was being hit hard by a flood of cheap cotton imports. If the crash in the market coincides with such a gigantic crop, things will be cheery indeed. Peter Ehrman, his business partner, is already fouling his breeches at the very thought of it, and the little tree frog is a pretty good barometer. Bankruptcies were picking up in London and Liverpool, overproduction was glutting the market, and Engels was adamant that the end of capitalism was nigh. Instead, it wasn't to be. Exports surged, wages rose, standards of living improved, and the mid-Victorian boom ground inexplicably on. In 1857, Engels' optimism returned as the markets faltered. The American crash is superb, he wrote, and not yet over by a long chalk. Now we have a chance. The conditions for revolution were once again ripe. With the capitalist mode of production in collapse, the working class would surely rise to the occasion. But 2 months into the crash, the proletariat had still yet to realize its historic calling. There are as yet few signs of revolution, Engels noted gloomily, for the long period of prosperity has been fearfully demoralizing. So you will appreciate, friends, that there is something of a prehistory to this evening's debate. Indeed, my old friends Marx and Engels have been predicting the end of capitalism for over 150 years. And now our opponents are suggesting that the immediate failure of such predictions invalidates our claim that Karl Marx is right. And we would suggest quite the contrary. To argue this in the wake of cash machines crashing in Cyprus, over £60 billion spent on bailing out British banks, and the repercussions of the global financial crash still making their way through eviscerated social fabric of so many Western societies, well, I put it to you, it is positively perverse. As Terry Eagleton has written, in the light of the continuing global financial crisis, to claim that Marxism was finished was rather like claiming that firefighting was out of date because arsonists were growing more crafty and resourceful than ever. I would like to suggest to you that Marx has rarely seemed more relevant. Marx's stock resurges on a 150-year tip was how the New York Times marked the 150th anniversary of the publication of the Communist Manifesto, a text which more than any other, as they put it, recognized the unstoppable wealth-creating power of capitalism, predicted it would conquer the world, and warned that this inevitable globalization of national economies and cultures would have divisive and painful consequences. And the Times was right. Ladies and gentlemen, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were the first to chart the uncompromising, unrelenting, compulsively iconoclastic nature of capitalism. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors, and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interests, than callous cash payments. It has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism in the icy water of egotistical calculation. And it was Marx who revealed how capitalism would crush languages, cultures, traditions, even nations in its wake. In one word, it creates a world after its own image, he wrote, long before globalization became a byword for Americanization. And Marx was also clear about the social consequences, the growing divisions between the lifestyles of the rich and the poor under unregulated capitalism, what Benjamin Disraeli and Ed Miliband would call the two nations. And in Britain, we have seen this problem with the emergence of the so-called squeezed middle. And the diagnosis is right. Our current models of capitalism are not working. The wealth generated by the growth prior to 2008 simply did not trickle down to ordinary people. Living standards began to stagnate from as early as 2003 and won't even return to that until well after 2015. And as for the growing extremes at the top and the bottom, well, just take a look at last week's fascinating Great British Class Survey with its account of the precariat, an update of Marx and Engels' proletariat and the elite. As Professor Mike Savage of the London School of Economics puts it, it is striking that we have been able to discern a distinctive elite whose sheer economic advantage sets it apart from the other classes. At the opposite extreme, we have discerned the existence of a sizable group which is marked by the lack of any significant amount of economic, cultural, or social capital. These are the two nations. The recognition of the existence of this group, along with the elite, is a powerful reminder that our conventional approaches to class have hindered our recognition of these two extremes, which occupy a distinctive place in British society. Who can tell us now that Karl Marx was wrong? So let us get to the crux of the matter. The 2008 crash and its lingering aftermath revealed the failure of the theology of the uncontrolled global free market. That is what we're arguing about. That is what capitalism is about. And all Marx and Engels' warning over the dangers of monopoly capitalism and concentrated finance have come to pass. So why then no total collapse of capitalism? Because right around the world, governments have been forced to bail out the so-called free market. We have bailed out the banks, we have subsidized industries, we've sorted out the insurance sector, we've underpinned financial services, we've kept the whole system afloat. From car scrappage schemes to AIG to nationalizing Fannie and Freddie Mae, it is the forces of collectivism which have saved capitalism. The level of public support, the extent of state involvement, how we all in this room bear the heavy burden of HBOS, Lloyds, RBS, and Northern Rock, how we as taxpayers underwrite every major transaction now across the city of London, how moral hazard has effectively been liquidated in the contemporary economy. The very continuance of capitalism under current conditions is proof that Karl Marx was right. Capitalism has once again crumbled under the weight of its own internal contradictions. And it is the state in America, in Cyprus, in China, in India, in the UK, which has once again saved it. The facade of normality is vindication of the crisis, and why you can have no hesitation in supporting this motion tonight. Although I do fear that Marx and Engels, rather than being delighted with the current turn of events, are themselves probably feeling fearfully demoralized. Thank you.
Thank you, Tristram. And our first speaker against the motion is George Magnus. George is an economist, commentator, and author. He has a long record as an economist in the financial services industry, most recently as chief economist and senior economic advisor at UBS for 15 years till recently. He now works as an independent consultant. George, your time starts now.
Thank you, Oliver, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. In the wilds of North London, where I live, near Highgate Cemetery, is a grave and a tombstone of the wily old political economist who's the subject of tonight's debate. Many of you may have been there to pay homage or simply to visit and reflect. But the revival of interest in Karl Marx since the financial crisis, and the reason he's here in spirit this evening, is because we're suffering, as I'm sure you know, an attack of deep economic pessimism. You'll also know very well that our fixation with this pessimism and crisis and capitalism is not unique. For example, John Maynard Keynes wrote about this in 1930 in a tract called The Economic Consequences for Our Grandchildren, in which he said, "It is common to hear people say that the epoch of enormous economic progress is over, and that a decline in prosperity is more likely than an improvement in the decade ahead of us." Eerily familiar words, but my view is that Keynes's dismissal of the pessimism of his own time has relevance today. And I'd like to argue 2 points. First, that the whole point about the contradictions of capitalism is not specifically whether Marx's analysis is relevant, which personally I think in many ways it is, but it's the outcome, it's the synthesis, and our capacity to basically nurture and establish coping mechanisms. And the second point is that the main threats to our economic and social model today come actually from two sources that didn't even exist until quite recently, and are neither the direct outcrop of capitalism nor terminal. So the first point, on Marx's tombstone, as you'll know if you've been there, there's an inscription taken from the Theses on Feuerbach, which says, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it," which is precisely what our antecedents have done by developing coping mechanisms like institutions of the rule of law, limited liability companies, trades union, mutual societies, insurance, welfare, and technological discoveries that drive productivity, income, and jobs. Finding those coping mechanisms is an endless task, and we need to make more progress on at least 3 of them. The first is that we can't obviously keep shifting income from the owners of labor to the owners of capital without experiencing income inequality, impoverishment of workers relatively, if not absolutely, excess capacity, and unemployment. The stronger investment that we had in the 1990s and the 2000s has, of course, given way to a bust. Real wages have been stagnant or declining. In this country, the median real wage has fallen by about 9% since 2009, back to levels last seen in 2003. And the labour compensation share of the national income has fallen, profit share has risen by about 5 to 10 percentage points in most rich countries. The second point is that finance, or second contradiction if you want, is that finance has been an enabler of innovation and growth. But, as articulated poignantly by the economist Hyman Minsky 30 years ago, it's also an endogenous source of systemic instability. I'm sure this doesn't need to go into any further explanation here, except to say that, as the raconteur and economist and diplomat J.K. Galbraith once quipped about recurring bouts of speculation and euphoria from Rome onwards, every generation basically suffers from a brevity of financial memory, and every generation makes the specious association between the ownership of money and the possession of intelligence. Bankers' pay and the wider issue of management remuneration, of course, are rarely out of the headlines and an obvious grappling iron for capitalism's critics. But the problem is that rent gouging, or rent seeking as it's more politely known, is the result of eminently fixable market and corporate governance flaws. We could, for example, break up the banks, as the Vickers Commission has urged. We could ban or restrict the use of stock options and other tools that tie remuneration to short-term stock market performance. There's nothing specifically systemic about not being able to fix these problems if we really want. The third point I'd just quickly mention is the need to cope better with globalization. Capitalism's propensity to globalize has generally been a force for the good, I'd submit, but the blowback in the form of the growing economic significance of China and other major emerging markets is a big problem. Integrating in their own ways Western capitalism's best practices from markets to modernity and from meritocracy to the rule of law, these countries are no longer just consumers of Western capitalism's goods and services, and in some respects clones, but also very powerful competitors and rivals. Big, big contradiction issues, without a doubt. But my point is that even if our existing political leaders suffer from myopia and something that I like to call deficit attention disorder, thank you, the capitalist model has been and remains adaptable. Now, the 2 points I mentioned earlier, which are relatively recent, are 21st century aging and technology, which actually have in some respects the flimsiest of links to capitalism, and are questionably, though, big issues. For example, in the first case, weak fertility and rising life expectancy are driving a unique and relentless rise in the age structure of our societies, never seen before. And it's challenging us to redefine the social rights and obligations of citizens versus the state. It's a very complex issue to get over, particularly at a time like this. And the thing about technology and automation is that they are also displacing white-collar, including skilled jobs, from retail to radiology and from clerical to even legal positions. And I think this explains partly the predominance of low-income, part-time jobs in countries that even have raised employment since 2009. Modern technology is equally an issue for emerging countries. For example, in China, the Taiwanese company Foxconn, who, as you know, manufacture for Apple, Sony, and lots of others in China, has started to substitute robots for workers. Their plan is to substitute 1 million by 2015. Automation and robots are generating very strong demand for labor at the top of the occupational structure and the bottom, leaving, as my opponent Tristram said before, those with average levels of human capital and skill in the middle, very vulnerable and dragging income inequality higher. We don't really know how we're going to solve this problem in the long run, but capitalism still has very persuasive credentials. Let me give you two little anecdotes. First, Henry Ford and a prominent labor leader supposedly once teased each other about factory robots not being able to pay union dues or buy motor cars. Henry just simply retorted that he was going to pay his workers twice the going rate, which he did, which underscores a process in capitalism that runs from productivity to higher wages and lower prices, rising demand and jobs and so on. There's also a story about Milton Friedman visiting a Chinese construction project and asking his host why workers were using so many shovels and so few machines. Told that this was a job creation project, Friedman said, in that case, why don't you give them spoons? The point, of course, is that capital, including human capital, makes people more productive and societies better off. And my hunch is that in time, the revolution going on in advanced manufacturing, in the energy sector, and new technology will deliver significant benefits. So in conclusion, Mr. Chairman, our opponents may argue that capitalism itself is the systemic problem behind our pessimism, and that markets don't work, and that a radical redrawing of the boundaries between the state and the private sector is necessary. Personally, I don't think anyone thinks that laissez-faire is the answer, but we should be careful what we wish for. The influential Chinese magazine Caixin warned the country's leaders recently that the heavy hand of the state was stifling competition, distorting resource allocation, and encouraging corruption and rent-seeking and social fragmentation. If China's leaders have the courage and will to implement difficult reforms in the next 5 to 10 years, Chinese capitalism will move our way. If they don't, we shall see. Ladies and gentlemen, finally, our predicament, I would submit, is not the sound of capitalism falling apart, but a painful period of adjustment from one economic and technological period to another. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Our second speaker for the motion is Robin Blackburn. Robin is Leverhulme Fellow at the University of Essex. He's a former editor of the New Left Review, where he's written on the collapse of Soviet communism and the credit crunch of 2008. Robin, your time starts now.
Thank you. Yes, Marx was right. If you study our motion, you'll see that we aren't arguing he was right about everything, simply about the contradictions of capitalism. What did Marx mean by contradictions? Let's look at some examples. Marx urged that capitalism, by generating wealth at one pole and poverty at another, destroyed its own momentum. Those who were badly paid or unemployed couldn't be good customers. In recent decades, growing inequality undermined accumulation. But the financial wizards had a fix. Wall Street and the city, having failed to nourish their own domestic economies, instead came up with the brilliant idea of becoming loan sharks, lending to the poor at high interest rates and then bundling these debts into supposedly fail-safe financial products. But extravagant inequalities eventually took their toll. US subprime borrowers, the poor, defaulted in droves, while tens of millions of underpaid Chinese workers couldn't buy much from the West or anyone else. These hard facts punctured the delirium of investors, pulled the rug from underneath the big banks, and brought on the global downturn. But here's the good news. Working people in China have protested at miserable pay. Recent worker militancy in China has raised wages, which would be good for global recovery if only the other governments were doing the heavy lifting to boost global demand. But there's no sign of concerted measures of debt forgiveness and public investment to reignite growth. This leads us to another contradiction. Namely, even as the different parts of the capitalist world become more interdependent, they each resort to beggar-my-neighbor policies. The IMF and World Bank should boost lending to producers, but instead they tolerate competitive austerity and urge all countries to strive for an export surplus, as if this wasn't a mathematical impossibility. It would be more rational to lend money to the man in the moon and then let him purchase any unsold inventory. That might sound ridiculous, but scarcely less so than the world of QE or quantitative easing, now practiced by the world's most powerful central banks. QE sounds a little queasy, a coded reference to financial bowel movements, but it's really no more than printing money and then putting it the way of banking folk. Next item in the repertoire of desperate expedients is helicopter cash, as the Financial Times explained last Friday. This involves, I kid you not, simply showering the population with great wads of notes, as if dropped from helicopters. But somehow the giveaways all land on the financial districts. If the financial authorities had the courage of their convictions, they'd instead pay out £50,000 to every citizen with the proviso that they must pay down debt or spend the money. This would really get the economy moving, but we all know it won't happen. It's too sensible. So here's another perversity of capitalism. Its official custodians resort to giveaways far bigger and far less justified than the welfare states they demonize. Official bailouts represent socialism for bankers, welfare for billionaires down on their luck. I should reiterate once again, Marx didn't get everything right. The workers haven't revolted in the way he thought likely. He didn't anticipate global warming or the World Wide Web or reality TV, and he was probably wrong about the declining rate of profit. But he did wrestle with the madcap logic of what he called fictitious capital. There'll be some here tonight who've heard enough nice things about Margaret Thatcher in the last 24 hours to last them a lifetime. Forgive me, therefore, for pointing out that while Karl Marx and Margaret Thatcher differed about almost everything, they agreed on the importance of capitalism. Many founders of economics and social science analyzed the dynamic of industrial society or commercial society or modernity. Marx coined this concept of a capitalist mode of production. He saw capital accumulation as the juggernaut of the age. A 19th century thinker, Marx saw rampant capitalism leading to a world of pervasive and unstable commodification. This was a world in which everything must be for sale and have its price. A world in which everyone has to become a two-legged profit and loss center. And everyone is urged to take on debt, to buy exotic insurance products, and to do their duty as insatiable consumers. On Saturday's Radio 4's Radio 4 Money Box, someone explained that enterprising banks have persuaded customers to insure against automobile theft, even when they don't actually own a car. Marx held that the world of capital was anarchic, that it had no regulatory center. Notwithstanding the IMF and World Bank, this is still true. When it comes to bailouts, the international organizations only have the resources that rich countries allow them to have. They don't have a fiscal base of their own. The ungoverned world of international money is constantly prone to speculation and crisis, because crisis is its only way of wiping slates clean and starting afresh. And money is sovereign because the world's great powers allow themselves to be pushed around by Bermuda and the Cayman Islands. Or perhaps something else is going on. Maybe it's some other organizations who are pushing us all around. The United States, with its boundless faith in capitalism, is also the country where, in October 2008, the Treasury Secretary opted to take out huge stakes in the big banks. The US administration also nationalized two global titans, General Motors and AIG. Though they didn't go nearly far enough, these measures were, for a time, quite effective. Indeed, in a contradiction Marx would have pounced on, the more successful types of capitalism borrow great doses of state intervention, coordination, and public entrepreneurship. It's the laggards and dunces who parrot the witless slogan that governments can't pick winners. In Taiwan, with its hugely successful science parks, or Brazil with its world-beating agricultural exports, they laugh at such idiocy. And then think of communist China with its state banks doing more to resuscitate global demand than have Western governments. The international markets are propped up by China's Politburo. There's a palpable contradiction of capitalism, this time one that cuts both ways, I agree. Here in Britain, successive governments have no faith in the British people, despite their outstanding record of innovation. Instead of endowing a string of public regional funds with the resources to get small and medium business investing again, they channel the cash to zombie banks whose only pathetic thought is to draw in their horns, deleverage and reduce exposure. Having lost a bundle betting on moonshine, they now refuse to invest in real research centers. Marx wanted to go beyond capitalism, but he didn't reject modernity. In fact, the word contradiction is borrowed from Hegel's dialectical philosophy, and as applied to capitalism, implied that there could be virtue in the market mechanism, so long as it's rescued from the greed of capitalists and the blinkered dogma of neoliberalism's high priests. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. Our second speaker against the motion is Madsen Piri. Madsen is president and founder of the Adam Smith Institute, the free market think tank. Madsen, your time starts now.
Okay. Like many public figures who leave a legacy, either in their writings or their deeds, Karl Marx was sometimes right and sometimes wrong. Everyone is, barring Edward Heath. I'm going to concentrate on some of the things Marx was wrong about, because they're relevant to the motion, and also it's actually more fun. He was wrong to predict that history would take us to the inevitable triumph of the proletariat and then stop. History shows no signs of doing either. Marx was also wrong to suggest that this would happen first in the most advanced economies as they reach the final stage of capitalism. In fact, such revolutions as took place came in less developed countries, less developed economies such as Russia and China. It has not happened in the advanced economies, and this could be because Marx was wrong about something else. He predicted that capitalism would drive down wages to survival level before its final denouement. But in fact, as economies became more advanced, both wages and living standards rose to levels not even dreamt of in Marx's day. And this seems to have lowered somewhat the pressure for revolutionary violence and change. Marx was also wrong about something very much more fundamental. He was wrong about change. And I don't just mean he was wrong about the changes that would come about. More fundamentally, he was wrong about how change takes place. He took the Hegelian model of change. Now, to the philosopher Hegel, change comes about in staccato triangles. A state of affairs nurtures its opposite, and from the violent clash between them, a new state of affairs emerges. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Violence is at the very core of it, and hence Marx's commitment to revolution. The folly is that Marx was a contemporary of Darwin. He'd read Darwin's Origin of Species. He actually admired Darwin's account of the origins of humankind. He failed, however, to spot the significance of Darwin's theory of change and to incorporate it into his own program. Darwin advanced a gradual mechanism of change in which small differences gradually come to dominate over time. It is evolutionary, not revolutionary, and it's a much more accurate description of how change usually happens in human societies. Much more accurate than was Hegel's account. Indeed, Darwin was right and Hegel was wrong. This, of course, means that Marx was also wrong about change and wrong about how capitalism would develop. The point is that capitalism changes and evolves. It has been through many transformations. The capitalism that Marx thought would collapse under its own contradictions is not the capitalism of today, the one that the motion refers to. In the material world, organisms evolve, they respond to crises, and they change. A similar thing happens with our social practices. They evolve and adapt to new circumstances. Capitalism has faced many crises. Each time it has evolved and changed. Each time a new form of capitalism has emerged to solve the problems its predecessor faced. This is how human beings progress. We solve our problems by adapting our practices. Yes, capitalism certainly faced a crisis in 2008, but it's still with us and as yet uncollapsed. It's evolving and responding to the changes that are needed. And as before, when the dust of crisis has settled, it will be a new version of capitalism that goes on to generate more wealth and to expand the opportunities open to humankind. The new version of capitalism that emerges will have to be one that somehow manages to keep at arm's length the politicians wanting to fix its outcomes for political advantage. Greedy bankers can only take reckless risks if politicians make it cheap for them to do so by turning on the taps of credit and money. Politicians like booms and bubbles because they help them to win elections and therefore office. And so capitalism must now find procedures to limit their ability to do this. those whose greed is for power are no less deadly than those whose greed is for gain, and both need rules to circumscribe their scope for action. I wish to make a further point, that capitalism will survive because it is the only valid way we've found that works in practice to create wealth and all of the opportunities that come in its wake. Marx was wrong about another important thing. He subscribed to the labor theory of value. He believed that the value of a thing arises from the labor put into producing it, hence surplus value, exploitation, charging people more than the labor cost of producing it, exploiting the workers. Wrong. Value is based on demand. If no one wants a thing, then no matter how much labor went into producing it, it is literally valueless. It has to be demand-based. We all value things differently, and that is the only reason trade takes place. We trade because we put a greater value on the thing that the other person has than what we're offering in exchange. And when we trade, we both gain something more valuable than we had. It's a win-win situation, and it creates wealth. We produce in order to trade and create wealth, and we invest in order to produce. That is, in essence, what capitalism is. And it works. It certainly works better than anything else that's been tried. And it works more humanely than anything else that's been tried. Yes, capitalism grows more complicated and more ambitious as it evolves, but its principles remain. Capitalism will survive its current crisis. It will be tweaked and modified, but it will not collapse because nothing has ever been found that can replace it or do what it does or bring the advantage and the benefits it brings. It has brought more to human achievement than any other institution devised by humankind. It's created wealth on an unprecedented scale. It's enabled us to conquer disease, to conquer poverty, malnutrition, starvation, disease. It's enabled us to fund arts, cultural activity, education, social services. Capitalism is the most benign thing people have ever done. And that is why this motion, cumbersome and ambitious as it is also misconceived, and why I urge everyone to vote against it.
Thank you, Madsen. Our third and last speaker for the motion that Karl Marx was right, capitalism post-2008 is falling apart under the weight of its own contradictions, is Frank Furedi. Frank is Professor of Sociology at the University of Kent. His forthcoming book is entitled Moral Crusades in an Age of Mistrust, the Jimmy Savile Scandal. Frank, your time starts now.
Good evening, comrades. and those of you that still believe that the earth is flat as well. I think that if you look at Karl Marx and you look at his writings on a wide variety of subjects, you'll find that he had a very simple interpretation of capitalism, a very compelling one. And he basically said that on paper, in theory, capitalism is a wonderful idea. It's a really brilliant idea. Free trade, free markets, individualism, individual self-development. Sounds really brilliant. He said, in theory, capitalism is a wonderful idea. The only trouble is that it doesn't work in practice. That's the only problem. It doesn't really work in practice. And one of the things that we find with capitalism, especially as it becomes more and more mature, is there's almost a desperate attempt to recast capitalism in a way that is almost a caricature of itself. Very often when you hear stories that capitalists say about their system, you almost imagine that they've been reading Harry Potter and they're just dying to write yet another volume, but this time, sort of with a capitalist happy ending. And the stories that you read in the newspapers are really very interesting. I don't know if you picked up this story a couple of weeks ago, which would have really amused Karl Marx. It was a very small story. It was really about the fact that our government, in its wisdom, has decided to privatize search and rescue operations. Basically, we now have a free market in search and rescue. It means that, for example, if you're stranded on a mountain, sort of in Scotland, then you got a choice of which company is going to come and rescue you. which basically in practice means that on the one hand you have one company that's fronted by Prince Harry. You know, you could have that brand as the guy that kind of does the business, or alternatively, maybe Prince Andrew will front the other organization that will do this. And what you find is that competition and the free market is increasingly recast in this very silly, you know, sort of kind of play-acting form where everybody knows the dirty secret, which is that, you know, when it comes to reality, everything has been sewn up sort of behind the scenes, and basically privatization in these circumstances is really not so much about the market, but about a state handout to a particular company. It is really the welfare state for the capitalists. It's their kind of dependency culture that they often sort of kind of go on about. Marx's theory of crisis is based on a simple idea. By the way, it's a theory of crisis that he actually shared with a lot of people who weren't even Marxists, who were often friends of capitalism. And if you read David Ricardo, if you read some of the writings of Sismondi de Sismondi, if you read even someone like Joseph Schumpeter in the 20th century, they all understood that capitalism has got an inherent tendency towards disintegration and towards collapse. The proposition is very simple. Capitalism has a tendency to destroy the very foundation on which it's built. If you look at the way that capitalism develops, it cannot tolerate a genuine free market. Capitalism destroys the values, the traditions, the religions on which it was founded. Capitalism cannot live with communities. The communities that gave rise in Scotland to Scottish political economy are inconsistent with what goes on beforehand, and therefore virtually everything that gave rise to capitalism, its very foundation, gradually gets unraveled through the process of accumulation. And therefore what we find is that with the passing of time, capitalism cannot continue to accumulate on its old basis. It reaches its limits. You see, what Marx was really objecting to wasn't inequality, I mean, that's the way it's often interpreted, wasn't the fact that some people were poor or some people were rich. Basically, his argument was very simple, was that capitalism cannot systematically deliver the goods, cannot systematically provide the living conditions that we need for a civilized society. There's also another point. Marx points out to the destructive consequences that are contained within capitalism, the tendencies towards disintegration, towards collapse. He makes the point that as capitalism becomes more and more mature, it loses vitality. It can no longer simply rely on individual capitalists to compete and raise productivity and increase production. It makes the point that as profit rates fall, increasingly capitalism destroys its own defenses and is forced to look for new institutional solutions to keep on going. It's what George called the coping mechanisms. Continually looks for different coping mechanisms to go on. And what he argues is that at a certain point, and this is the decisive insight, the sociological insight that Marx provides, at a certain point, capitalism is forced to seek refuge in institutions and in customs that actually contradicts its very nature. I mean, that's what we saw with the search and rescue operation. It actually is forced to find refuge in institutions that have got nothing to do with the inner workings of capitalism as it emerges. By the end of the 19th century, we find that free competition gives way to monopoly, an organized form of competition, because you simply cannot tolerate real people genuinely competing. So you've got these big, massive kind of monopolies that carve up the market. You have a situation where it's not the Labour Party, it's not the left, it's not the socialists, it's the capitalists themselves that go beg the state to intervene. And state intervention becomes the way of life of modern capitalism. In fact, the capitalist class is so addicted to state intervention that it simply cannot do without it. I don't know if you realize, but even in Britain today, we got this so-called neoliberal government. I don't know where neoliberalism comes from. All that I know is that in Britain, in British society, the state accounts for something like almost half of GDP. Anything between 45 to 47% of GDP is actually carried out through state expenditure. And if you find even in neoliberal United States, the state plays a very active role in propping up capitalism in all the key areas, all the important domains. So we have credit. I mean, Robin talked eloquently about quantitative easing. I mean, where is the free market there? You basically got these guys sitting around in the Bank of England and say, how much should we give to these people? How big a handout does capitalism need today? Let's ease their life, and you kind of, sort of circulate all this money. Where's the free market? Where is the basic logic of classical capitalism in this? And in a sense, what we find is that capitalism under these circumstances can only continue by destroying its very foundation. At a certain point, you cannot simply increase state intervention. I mean, Cameron is right. If the state increased expenditure, we have a massive disaster. It's reached its limits. You cannot just simply, sort of throw more money at the problem. At a certain point, you have what someone like Joseph Schumpeter, who was a friend of capitalism, called destructive creation. And it was this destructive creation that allows capitalism to periodically survive. My argument is that rather than use Schumpeter's term of destructive creation, we have got to understand that, or creative destruction, we have to understand that the key challenge that faces us in the 21st century is not to sort of look and pretend that there's no problem, but to understand how we manage the destruction that our societies are experiencing and will continue to experience. There's no doubt that the capitalist system will need to restructure itself in a very fundamental way. And the only way that it can do that is if it erodes the existing institutional framework within which it's based. So the question becomes, do we manage that destruction in a way that doesn't benefit the mass of society, but only a small section of it? Or do we have a grown-up discussion, a serious grown-up discussion, which genuinely attempts to manage that destructive way in a sense that it will have a progressive outcome? Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Our third and last speaker against the motion is Judith Shapiro. Judith is a former revolutionary Marxist. She was previously part of the team headed by Jeffrey Sachs, advising the Russian Ministry of Finance in Moscow in 93-94. She's currently a tutor in economics at the London School of Economics. Judith, your time starts now.
All right, thank you. I have three basic propositions to put you against the motion. First of all, capitalism is not collapsing. Let's have a reality check. If we simply look around the hall at this packed auditorium of the vibrant middle classes who are engaged in the Royal Geographical Society, which in Marx's day was an elite dinner club and now has 10,000 fellows who belong to that middle class. And if we think about the fact that there are grave threats to our welfare, but that this is very different both from the 1930s. If you are of my age, you have parents who told you over and over about that. It is both very different from that and very different from a system that I did see collapsing, the Soviet Union, which did fall apart of its own contradictions. Some people may try to explain that that was capitalism, but some people will try to explain anything. The point is that instead of the system collapsing of its own contradictions, it is, as the speakers who said they were for the motion have said, it is finding ways which are not strictly free market to keep itself going. And the notion of capitalism as a model, which can only be a market, is a model in our minds. It is not a reality. Capitalism as a word is our model of modern society. The second point is, as I've said, that it is indeed a grave crisis. This is not just another crisis. It is not like the oil shocks. It is not like the dot-com bubble. It is not like the 1997 Asian crisis. This is an more or less epochal crisis in the sense that we have to resolve it in a very serious way in which we change the way that modern society works. And what we're doing right now is arguing about who is going to pay for the debt that has been run up, or in complicated terms, deleveraging. And what I want to put to you as the most single important point I would like you to take away tonight is that whatever is decided in the technicalities, and some of my students have written in a little blue booklet that you have, most of you, about these technicalities, however we do it, what we have to do is start reversing the inverse burden law, as I see it forming, in which the people most responsible for the crisis are bearing the least burden, and those least responsible, because they're not being exploited in the Marxist sense, they're outside the system, they are paying the most. And that is really, looking at what can happen with that, it's a fairly simple story of what happened when we had that sort of debt as a result, both of the 30s and of World War II, that we had moderate and mild inflation, and we had other means that go by the slightly frightening term financial repression, which is a term many of you may not know, but trust me, you will. And it will no longer seem a technical term, particularly if you've figured out what credit default swaps are and how they differ from other sorts of initials you've had to learn. So, and the euro is a separate question that I leave aside here, because it was not economics in command, but politics that gave the mistaken decision to have a single currency for an area that can't hold it. And how you unscramble that omelet is a separate question, about which I think there are intelligent squared debates. Okay, the third proposition, the final one, is that there is nothing whatsoever in Marxist economics that helps you to understand it. Some of the finest writing on the financial crisis I know is Robbins in New Left Review, starting, in fact, in 2006 with a wonderful article well before it was happening. But I have noticed, I have not calculated it statistically, but we could put a student to work at this, that calling yourselves a Marxist or not a Marxist gave you no particular advantage in foreseeing it. Robin did not see, I'm sure he would agree, the depth of it. In fact, Nouriel Roubini, who is definitely not a Marxist, did. Not because he's brilliant, not because of his analysis, he may be, both of them may be correct, but because he lives in New York City and likes to have parties where bankers came. And he found out to his fright what was happening. There's another book I recommend by someone who's never done that sort of partying, but he has, but at other people's money, Nick Dunbar, who was a physicist and who's written a very wonderful, very easily readable book if you can stand books that don't have much economic analysis and have no graphs and no equations. These make me edgy, but they may make you happy. It's called The Devil's Derivatives, each to his taste. And the point is that, as Robin himself said, I think it was Robin, the falling rate of profit is probably wrong. Frank Ferroti basically made fun of all Marxism. And Tristram Hunt, as a member of the Labour Party and an MP, really doesn't want to get up and say that he believes Marxism is right. He is having a very good debating style, which he can do well, and enjoying himself, as I hope you are too. But none of these people are Marxists. None of them believe that. None of them believe that capitalism is collapsing. And to vote that way just to scare the idiots who are not doing policy right is a mistake. That's why Nouriel Roubini first said Marx was right. He was fed up the way that, I don't know about you, but I felt when I saw what was happening about Cyprus. We nearly had a second Lehman Brothers. And everybody was doing their own thing and all over the map. And it was terrifying. But then they did actually get some cold water dashed on them, and they did the right thing. They may not. And that is why we need education. We need to know what we're doing so that we ourselves can take more of a role. Because another thing, apart from the growth of the middle classes, so that you have not been ground down, but the reverse, and all over the world this is happening, including in China, that it is the educated middle classes in Shanghai and in a city where they did not want a poisonous cancer factory. This is what I think is the forward march in China. And it will be also in Russia. It will be the educated middle classes there. And that is what we should not feel sorry about. Tristram Hunt, I was disappointed to see his article in the FT yesterday. I hope it was just a mood piece, because I'm sure he was asked, because he is the finest chronicler of the middle classes. So I have had a joke before in January, February, that I have 5 opponents, that I don't agree with Madsen, for example, on laissez-faire. But actually, there are 6 people, counting me, on this panel who have argued to you to support this, to oppose this motion. And that's what I'm asking you to do, to see the sense behind the rhetoric and the good jokes, and to choose both common sense and reality so that we can go forward and we can find a solution where the burdens are as little as possible. It will be unpleasant, but it will not be hell if we do it right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Judith. Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard 6 lucid expositions. We're now going to move on to questions. I'd invite you to give questions or contributions as briefly and succinctly as you can. But before we do that, I have the results of the initial poll, the question you were asked as you came into the hall. To remind you, the motion in front of you is Karl Marx was right. Capitalism post-2008 is falling apart under the weight of its own contradictions. The result so far is very evenly balanced. For the motion, there are 203 votes. Against the motion, there are 214. And don't knows number 197. So it's roughly a third. There is everything to play for. We'll now turn to questions, and the first question is from me. I'm going to ask very briefly, if you would, lady and gentlemen, if you would each take a question from me. First, the proposers of the motion. Gentlemen, George referred to finance as an endogenous source of systemic instability, and he added that with an audience like this, he didn't need to elucidate the concept. Is he not right that your analysis of the inherent contradictions of capitalism is geared specifically to something that is outside the system? It's the failures of finance capital. Any of you, perhaps you'd like to respond to that?
Well, I think on the contrary, I think that what happens in the financial domain is a reflection of the fundamental contradictions that takes place within the process of production. I think that the most significant development over the last 40 or 50 years has not been the securitization of economic life. I think that's bad enough. It's been the inability of capitalism to maintain rises in productivity, rises in innovation. It's its inner tendency towards stagnation in the production process, which is the central core of the capitalist system that's at issue. The financial system merely reflects that, because the problems of production are displaced through the credit mechanism in the financial system. And I think that if it was only finance, then we wouldn't have a problem. But it's precisely because the productivity rises have been pretty stagnant since the 1960s. I think all of you would agree on that. And that needs to be explained. How can a vibrant system fail to maintain the momentum that it achieved in the past?
Okay. Sorry, please, Robin.
I want to pitch in just quickly that I think really finance is too important, too valuable to be left in private ownership and run on commercial lines. So really the essential point is, of course, we can avoid this collapse that's going on, but the way to do it would be to socialize finance and to have not just one, of course, but a variety, a considerable variety of publicly owned, responsible, accountable institutions, funds, and financial institutions.
Okay, the opponents of the motion, Robin referred in his speech to the madcap logic of fictitious capital. Are you not making too big an exception in your exposition of the resilience of capitalism if you leave that out? Any of you?
The point is that Marx had this phrase, fictitious capital, but it's not at the center of his analysis. Unfortunately, those people who have not read Marx cannot today understand who's right about what Marx meant. If you want to try to do it, I have written some notes on where you can look. It gave me a headache Sunday to go back to that stuff. Because Marx did not finish what he was writing. On the falling rate of profit, Robin could even say Marx was right because Marx didn't publish chapter 13 of volume 3. Engels did. It took him 11 years going over Marx's notes to make sense of it. And it should have been like what we do in conferences. It should have had on the front, this is a preliminary draft. Please do not do not cite without the author's consent. P.S. Author's residence, Highgate Cemetery. But Engels didn't do that. He felt his debt to Marx to finish it. And it is not coherent, it does not hang together, and it is not science as I understand it, because science as I understand it has testable hypotheses, and it is instead ideology. It may be good. So that's my view on fictitious capital was one idea that you can pluck and then you can talk about it. But it's not at the center. The productivity is, but productivity isn't. I love the idea of people being able to put on the internet what Trotsky said, mankind's productive forces stagnate, and then send it out, post it to the web, have it on their iPad and say we haven't had any growth. Capitalism is stagnating. I've read it myself today and I put it up on my blog.
Okay. George, quickly, and then Tristram, quickly, before we go to the audience.
Well, okay, then quickly. So I think that if you look around the world and, historical development, I mean, our technological achievements, there is a problem with productivity. It's quite, it's quite cyclical. But I mean, the standards of living that we have achieved and that other people all over the world aspire to, are real. And they are brought about as a consequence of investment and of, the development of coping mechanisms. Finance is a problem. And, my understanding of Marx, that there isn't a huge amount of finance in Marx, but he was quite, critical of what he called the subordination of industrial capital to finance capital. It's basically what the contemporary economic debate is about, banks doing all sorts of stupid things with derivatives when they should be lending to SMEs and so on and so forth. Nobody would disagree with that. And I think, unfortunately, it is a problem, as I indicated before, that Galbraith, quite correctly quipped, which is that every generation does it. We all think we're cleverer than our parents and our grandparents. We always make the same mistakes, but we carry on, and that's life.
Tristram.
Judith is right to take us back to the language of Marx and what Marx assumed that he was himself writing about. And when Marx wrote about capitalism, he wrote about the kind of capitalism which Engels was working in Manchester in the 1850s and 1860s. And this was red in tooth and claw, laissez-faire, night watchman state, free market capitalism. That is the capitalism which is under discussion this evening. What we have this evening and what we have at the moment in terms of our current economic models would, from Marx and Engels' perspective, be a form of collectivism. As Frank said, when you've got the state operating at 45, 47% of GDP, this is not the kind of pure capitalism which Marx was critiquing. So in Marx's own terms, in Marx's own language, the nature of capitalism, the contradictory forces inherent in free market capitalism on his own terms, is the issue we should focus on this evening.
Thank you, Tristram. Questions or contributions from the floor? I'll take three at once. First, the lady in the middle there, then the gentleman there, and there's a question right at the back. If the ushers could take the microphones there, but Madam first.
I have a question for the speakers speaking for the motion. So you say that capitalism is falling apart, but you haven't really responded to Madsen's argument that capitalism is the best system that we've got. So what would you see as the alternative to capitalism?
I should have asked you to say your name first, and if there is
Victoria.
any... Victoria. Victoria's question, any of you?
Well, I think that there is no doubt about the fact that capitalism is disintegrating, and there's no doubt about the fact that Marx's analysis of this trend is absolutely correct. But Marx had two theories. He had a theory of collapse, and he had a theory of change. And his theory of change was that no system collapses by itself unless there is an alternative, unless there's a social grouping prepared to offer a different world. And I would argue that at the moment, the big challenge that faces us is not to revel in the fact that capitalism is collapsing, that we've got these big problems that Judith outlined, but to work out a way of how we can manage what is a very serious process of destruction that we're going to be faced with in the next 10, 15 years. We haven't begun to see what this depression is really like. And I think in the course of that, we can begin to develop our alternatives. I think the key thing is not to close our minds to the future. We've got to stop living in the past. I mean, this is a discussion about 19th century thinkers, but we really do need the 21st century equivalent of people who are future-oriented and can begin to develop some kind of alternative.
Sorry, two questions at once. There's a gentleman here and a lady, I think a lady right at the back. Please, sir.
Hello, I'm Bill Durody. Really a question for all of you. I think there's almost unanimous agreement on the panel that there is systemic failures, if not at the very least systemic problems. And therefore the key question is, how do you differentiate yourselves in terms of what is the agency that will address that systemic failure? Now, Judith has told us that the correct agency is to have cold water poured on you by an unelected bureaucracy in Brussels. I was wondering what the other panelists thought the agency is.
Okay, and a question at the back.
Kerry Dingle from the education charity World Right and Citizen TV World Bites. Two quick questions. Firstly, if the speakers, for or against the motion, do you believe in the idea of a canon, in which case, and a new canon for our times, would you have Marx on it, and which of his writings might be on there? And second quick question, today's debates seem to be that happen in the public sphere, seem to demonstrate, and we've seen it here too, that whether you consider yourself left or right, or perhaps neither, the state is the only solution, state intervention or welfarism. Isn't there a better way to go, taking up neither of those? And what are your views on that?
Okay, I'll turn to the opponents of the motion, first to that second contribution. George, what writings of Marx do you think should be on the canon, if any, and any of you? What is the agency that you see as dealing with these, remedying these problems?
Right. The writings are very rich, and there's some wonderful quotes, but I would have to settle on the one that I put in my main presentation, which is the bit about, explaining the world, and the point is to change it. And of course, we've heard a lot of kind of political rhetoric and explanations about what has been, what is, what might be, what should be, what shouldn't be. The point is, what do we do about the situation, which kind of addresses your question about the agency and your question as well about what would you do otherwise. I mean, there are clearly a lot of ways that in an emergency such as we're in at the moment, where, if the private sector actually can't do something because it's trying to behave in a certain way, the government has to compensate. So, the insanity of what I've previously called this deficit attention disorder is the private sector is trying to save. It's designed, it's what it exactly should do, because we actually ran up too much debt and we, were seduced into buying things that we shouldn't have been buying on tick, and now we have to kind of change it. So what kind of insanity is it for the government to try to save at the same time that the private sector is trying to save? So I don't think this is a problem of capitalism per se. I think this is a problem about political behavior. And a lot of the things that I think we've heard from our opponents really are, or is about, just chronic and asinine political behavior. And we haven't even spoken about the Eurozone yet, but anyway. And that's really, you know, and that I don't think is a systemic problem. So I think there are genuine things. I mean, I accept the point that, you know, that the sort of 18th century capitalism is clearly, you know, a different beast from the kind of thing that we have today, and the government does have a big role to play. The state can facilitate change. Mutualization can also facilitate change too. I mean, we have a lot of proposals which are being looked at, for example, in the finance sector, about how you can mutualize financial services and financial institutions for kind of limited purpose banking. I mean, not everybody's cup of tea, but I think, you know, we could take these kinds of things quite seriously.
Robin.
Marx's writings on the Paris Commune certainly would deserve to be in that canon, and they dispel the myth that he idolized the state. And I really want to respond to the question which said, is the only answer to the collapse, the tendency to collapse of capitalism, which is much graver in some parts of the world than others, but it's a reality really globally. Is there any way that the state intervention that is needed to stem that collapse, is there any way in which that can be saved from bureaucratism and elitism and all the other problems that two mighty states breed? And I would argue that there's an idea there in Marx that the state could be used to set up organizations, social funds, for example, even cooperatives, just because they're set up by the state, because they're publicly owned, because they're accountable to some group. That doesn't make them commercial, it doesn't make them capitalist. And so really what I was saying earlier, finance is the source of dynamism of capitalism, but it's failing us now. So we need to rejuvenate with a state that intervenes, that sets up networks of regional funds that get people working again. And I think that's desperately needed. And certainly that should include small and medium business, get them working too. But the financial level should be one at which democratic criteria should apply. It doesn't mean the state should micromanage everything. In fact, the state should get out of a lot of things, even that it does now. But they shouldn't be handed back to the failing capitalist model, but rather to some new model based on public ownership and social cooperation.
Tristram, you wanted to come in on this?
I just want to make a plea for Engels rather than Marx. Engels of the Condition of the Working Class in England is a superb text. And when I go and teach in schools in my constituency in Stoke-on-Trent, I give them Engels' account of going to Stoke in the early 1840s and seeing the skin peel off the fingers of children as they're dipping the Dalton and the Wedgwood ware into the chemicals which made such beautiful products in the potteries. And people aren't so sceptical about the role of a health and safety executive after that. I would also just say that Robin's exactly right, that Marx's great achievement was to historicize capitalism, was to suggest that there is a history to it, which obviously meant that there could be an end to it. But there are other forms of wealth creation. And when we look at the cooperative model, the mutual model, the associationist model, even the family business model, these are more interesting models of contemporaneous capitalism.
Thanks, Tristram. Other questions? There's one right at the back, a gentleman with glasses. There is a gentleman right at the edge. Is there a lady with a question? There, 1, 2, 3.
My question is, Michael Seifert. My question is based partly on what Robin said, which is about Marx's writing about the Paris Commune, because if you remember, he said that men make their own history, but they don't do so in conditions of their own choosing. The weight of past generations weighs like an Alp on the mind of the present generation. And what he meant by that was that people can't, just when they try to think they're trying to break free from the ideas that they've inherited from previous generations, they find themselves unable to do so and unable to face it. But my question, based on that, and based on Marx's historical breadth, which starts with primitive communism, slavery,
Can we just get to the
serfdom.
question, please?
My question is, do the panel think that capitalism really is the highest form of social development for humankind?
Okay, second question there.
My name is Igor. I'm just independent person. It's a question to the members of the panel who are voting against the motion. I'd love to hear your views on the following. Do we even live, at least in Western Europe, do we even live in Western Europe under capitalism? Is it still capitalism? Can we call it capitalism with a welfare state, NHS, the state intervention and savings of banking systems, auto industries, etc., where the state controls more than 50%, in some countries like France, probably 70% of GDP? Can we still call it capitalism? That's my first question.
Okay,
And
can we
if
leave it at one? Because
well, subsequently, or...
No, can we leave it at one, please? I don't wish to be discourteous, but there are other questions.
Okay. I have to explain the question, right?
Thanks very much. Third question, there, please.
Thank you. My name is Anne Cormack. I'm red in tooth and claw, a capitalist, but I have worked in my career in the private sector as well as the public sector. My question to the panel is it not social democracy that is rather failing us now? In the sense that if you look back at the causes of the crash, I would say it was actually the policies implemented by both Bill Clinton and also the previous Prime Minister in this country, actually allowing people who were not capable of having the right assets to be able to support borrowing to go beyond what was feasible and realistic and sensible for them to borrow. In those political moves lay the seeds of the financial crash that eventually happened. And actually what we're seeing around the place is a broken social democratic model rather than broken capitalism.
Thanks very much. I'll turn to the opponents of the motion first, whichever of you wants to deal with those three quite linked questions. Is capitalism the highest form of social development? Is it in Western Europe indeed still capitalism? And is it not social democracy rather than capitalism that's failing? Judith.
Yes, they are linked, I think. First of all, what do I think personally? I think my other panelists might disagree. Is capitalism the highest form? I hope not. But first of all, we will need to be in a situation where basically we have abolished scarcity. Until we have that, as Trotsky brilliantly put it in The Revolution Betrayed, when you have shortages, queues form. Then a policeman is called to keep order. He never fails to help himself first. So, and I think that I ignored the problem when I chose to leap into Marxism. I knew already, as a PhD in economics, who really believed in it also, that scarcity was not going to be abolished easily. And with the new things we have seen that Frank Froede thinks haven't happened, the productivity gains, we have so many more things we want all over the world. And we are not, of course we could want less. I am happy I no longer want plastic bags, and I'm perfectly willing to have a cloth bag I carry around, and it doesn't have to have a label. Now, but the point is that we can want somewhat less, and maybe that's one of the things we will get out of this long period of deleveraging, that we will learn to live with less and with more leisure, which we didn't learn to do. And we will have, there are some positive sides to it, but it will be not in our lifetimes, and I don't think in your children's lifetimes, not even the youngest people in the room. But someday I hope that many things will be, again, as Trotsky said, like a well-mannered boarding house. But I personally, as somebody who tends at a well-mannered boarding house to take the eggs I like first, I have to be careful and think, yes, first there have to be enough eggs for everybody. And that's the, I don't want to, my answer to the other is, do we even live under capitalism? That is a definitional question, and I don't think that it is relevant unless you are a Marxist. know if it's good or not first. Then we can work out what it is. And again, social democracy, no, I think social democracy has to decide what it's doing. That one of the problems was that what I call social democracy and what I came to next decided instead to buy into the bubble and the boom. And it needs to find its way back. And I hope that people like Tristram will be part of that. Because they went from the right of me to the left of me to the right of me in a whiz, and many of you others may have felt that. I think there is a role for government in the banks, for example. I think I'll stop.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Frank,
I could
yes.
go on,
Yeah.
yes.
I think that you can blame social democracy for many, many bad things, but not for causing the problems, because the interesting thing is that no matter what the government is, whether it's a Reagan-led government or a Christian Democratic-led government in Germany, or a social democratic government in France or in England, we see a similar pattern of relying more and more on the credit mechanism. We see a situation where under Reagan and Thatcher, you had the securitization of the credit system. Under Reagan, in the earlier period, you have actually an increase in state expenditure for a certain period of time, but state expenditure not necessarily for welfare payments, but for armaments and for other areas. So I think it's important to realize that there is no government in the Western capitalist world that didn't buy into this policy, whose consequences we're now paying for. I haven't sort of come across any of that in the 70s and the 80s and the early 90s. I think that the really important thing for us to remember here is that the state can be used for all kinds of reasons. At the moment, we have the wrong balance. A state ought to be providing resources for productive investments, like the way that Labour did for the Channel Tunnel in the 70s, or the way that the French have done with high-speed trains. But instead of doing that, we're spending state expenditure on transfer payments in a way that has got no productive outcomes or consequences. And I think we do need to have a very serious discussion of the balance between private capital and the state that at the moment all the political parties are avoiding.
George, quickly.
Very quickly. I mean, I just want to endorse pretty much everything that Judith said. I'm not going to repeat it. I thought it was eloquently put. As an economist, sorry, it's a bit nerdy, right? But that's kind of what I do. But the standard text now about what do we know about financial crises and why do they happen and how do they behave and how do you get over them is now a book by two American economists called Rogoff and Reinhard. It's called 8 Centuries of Financial Crises. 8 Centuries of Financial Crises. This time it's different, i.e. it never is different. And I think, Frank's point, which is that it didn't really matter what kind of political system it was, whether it was social democracy, whether it was free market, whether it was, whatever it was. I mean, everybody suffered from the same problem. And the problem is, just deregulation, in my opinion. That actually the idea about that you could free up those animal spirits in finance and expect human behavior to control itself. I mean, it's a human problem. And it's something that is, it's a serial human problem that goes back to the days of Rome and even before. It's not a uniquely capitalistic problem. It's exaggerated by capitalism because of the nature of it. But I think that the idea that as I said before, there are lots of interesting ideas about, whether it's, mutual societies or, cooperatives. But, having state banks, the Chinese banks were mentioned before. The Chinese banks are insolvent. So, and the only way that they stay in business is because they get continuously bankrolled by the state. That's not the answer either.
Okay. Quickly, Robin.
I rather think it is absolutely the answer. I think one of the marvelous things about the crisis is we suddenly realize money, which used to be that great thing that there was such a huge lack of, that actually governments can just conjure it into existence and can endow other institutions with it. So instead of them using it to endow commercial banks, I would rather think the network of social funds, that would be a much more creative way to use it. And I think it sort of provides some of the answer to the question, can we do better? I think if we look at the world, there's too much misery, far too much. And I think it would be wrong for Judith to imply that we can sort of live with that and imagine the market will spontaneously solve it. The market hasn't solved it. So I think we've got to tackle it deliberately. I'm just back from Brazil and Ecuador, and I can say those countries have seen inequality sharply reduced in the last 10 years because there are radical social democratic governments that haven't given up the ghost, as sadly most European social democrats have done, and have taken really stern steps to spread economic initiative to show that there is such a thing as public entrepreneurialism that can tackle problems and get the economy moving.
Thanks, Robin. We're going to move now to closing statements from each of the speakers. While they are giving their closing statements, the ushers will come round with ballot boxes. To remind you, you have a card with for or against printed on it. If you are in favour of the motion, please put the part of the card denoting for in the ballot box. If you are against, put against. If you're undecided, put the whole card into the ballot box. To remind you, ladies and gentlemen, the motion is Karl Marx was right. Capitalism post-2008 is falling apart under the weight of its own contradictions. While you are voting, if you could be silent, please, while the speakers deliver their closing remarks in reverse order of having spoken. So our first speaker against the motion will be Judith from the platform. Our first speaker will be Judith Shapiro. Just a couple of minutes summing up your case, Judith, please.
Right. Well, let me concentrate on a misunderstanding, which can only be deliberate, that two people have said that I think it's all going to happen spontaneously. But I've made it very clear that, in fact, the people like you and me have to do something about it. Now, in fact, the agency with which we will probably have to work is what Marx called bourgeois democracy. That means political parties usually, but they don't have to be the existing political parties. I have slowly and reluctantly come to the conclusion that there is no other way out of the euro than to unwind it. So I think the new party being formed in Germany to argue for that is probably right. And I think that the French system needs such a party also because it came before its time and it has been a disaster and it threatens all of us, including us offshore islands. So I think that's very important. When I ask you to vote against the motion, it doesn't mean nothing is to be done. It's the opposite. It's because something is to be done and we have to do it. Now, on the question of the state and the market, which are definitely differences that, as I understand it, divide us on each side of the panel, not between the two. Each country and each time has a different relationship. The question is also which state and which market. East Asian states have been able to do what my friends in Eastern Europe knew would be a disaster. It may be that the Brazilian state is doing it well. I have not been there, and I am very suspicious always of reports from faraway places. I heard it about the great Chilean pensions, but I never bought it when they privatized them. But I would like to know more about it because some states can. There was enormous inequality in Latin America to be reduced. It was low-hanging fruit. Reducing inequality in Western Europe is going to be more difficult, and in the United States. So I think it's very important in asking you to vote against the motion that you understand that we are talking not about accepting the status quo, but rather of seeing our side as having more to say about what is to be done, and the other side of taking the view that it's all so terrible, and maybe even, as Tristram's first quote from Engels said, "Ooh, goody," and then was disappointed that it was not getting so terrible. Now, I know none of those speakers, including Tristram, have that point of view. They don't want it to get worse. But the point is there are things to be done, and we have to decide what. Unlike Frank Ferrotti, I'm not willing to wait 15 years while we work out an alternative. I'm not going to buy into a movement again, which tells me that we'll think it up after we take power. And so, therefore, what we need to do is to take the first steps, decide what are good policies, decide which state can do it and do it well. I know we don't need the housing bubble that George Osborne is planning for us, but if he really goes ahead, I personally think that you and me should buy some property in the autumn to sell it in 2 years when we have the crash, just before the crash. I'm usually bad at that. But the point is, in asking you for your votes, what I am asking you to do, my other panelists may feel differently, I am asking you to say that the present situation is not a good one, but it is the best we have, and we need to play the hand we have been dealt. And let us hope that we will play it well. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Judith. For the motion, your summing up comments, Frank.
The reason why I find Marx so compelling in so many ways is because of all the 19th century thinkers, and possibly the 20th century ones as well, he was the one that was able to give the most systematic expression of the values of the Enlightenment. I think that when it comes to the basic values of freedom and progress, Marx put forward a very robust, future-oriented view of possibilities. He didn't just talk about how bad things were. He was much more interested in pointing the way forward to how great they could be. And his criticism of capitalism wasn't that it was just a bad system, that it wasn't somehow working all right, or that it was too sort of exploitative. His real criticism was that capitalism couldn't deliver the goods. It actually held back progress. And the argument that really motivated Marx, and the argument that he really developed, the one that is, I think, very relevant for us, was a very simple one. And it had to do with history. As Tristan was saying, Marx historicized capitalism, but what he also did was to show that history is not something that is out there. History isn't something that just happens behind our backs. Unlike many other defenders of capitalism who see history as something that happens to us, somehow, as Judy said, we have this hand that's given to us and we've got to deal with it. He actually believed that history was made by human beings. We don't have to be the objects of history. We don't have to be the objects of history. We could transform the world around us. We can be the makers, the subjects of history. And it's his theory of human subjectivity, which was the other side of his theory of capitalism, that we really need to think about in the 21st century. Not because we need to merely repeat what he had said. There's no point in merely finding refuge in the past, but because we too need to begin to develop an outlook that sees ourselves as the makers of our circumstances rather than merely the passive voyeurs that we are. And I think in 21st century Britain, when passivity is so deeply institutionalized, when we really fail to take risks, to begin to take matters in our own hands, where we're continually asking somebody else to do stuff for us, where we really have become disempowered and become so powerless that all that we can imagine is that the state is the only institution that could sort things out. Under those circumstances, rereading Marx, especially for those of you of the younger generation, will pay some very rich dividends.
Summarising against the motion, Madsen Piri.
I don't think capitalism is the highest product of human social activity, but I do think it is a cooperative human social activity. If I were to put a book into the canon, I'm very reluctant to do that, because once books are in the canon, people do have the habit of slaughtering large numbers of their fellow men and women in the name of those books. I would, however, think this is unlikely to happen with Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments. In that book, he said that the most salient human characteristic is our ability to empathize with our fellow men and women, to think as they think, see the world from their point of view, share their joys and sorrows. And at the heart of capitalism is cooperation. Marx thought it was exploitative and aggressive, but it isn't. It arises from human nature, from that empathy we have with others. When we trade, we cooperate. The very first act of trade is human beings cooperating. It's not someone aggressively seeking only their own personal gain. When someone invests, they put aside the spending power they could be enjoying, and instead they forego present consumption and put that money to use by someone who wants to create goods and services that other people will enjoy, and use that money to advantage to provide betterment for other people. I think capitalism will survive because inherently it goes with the grain of human nature.
Thanks, Madsen. Summarising his case, I beg your pardon, summarising his case for the motion is Robin Blackburn.
Yeah, I think Madsen would find it interesting to dip into Das Kapital because Marx pays great tribute there to cooperation in the capitalist mode of production. And he says really it's private property that's getting in the way of realization of even higher levels and more effective levels of cooperation. In the Communist Manifesto, he famously pays tribute to capitalism, and it's the fact that it's unleashed enormous productive powers. I would put the manifesto on my list for a canon, but I would say that while it has great epoch-making ideas, it also has tiny little ideas that are quite interesting too. Like one of them, he has a 10-point action program at the back. One of them is to have a progressive income tax. Funnily enough, in the world of 1848, when it first appeared, there was no country that had a progressive income tax. So that was an interesting idea that's been taken up quite widely. I just would like to mention in that regard, I was introduced by the President Correa in Ecuador to the chief of his tax collection unit, who, as it happened, is an Ecuadorian man called Carlos Marx. And the thing that Carlos Marx told me is that he'd had the revolutionary idea for Ecuador, not of raising taxes. He said he thought that they were just about at the right level, but of actually getting people to pay their taxes. He'd actually managed to double the country's tax revenue by this novel procedure. So I would just conclude, I think we've got to learn to innovate in social affairs as well as in technology, and that one of the innovations would be public entrepreneurship, of seeing things that there's a crying need for something to be done about, and democratically deciding to commit resources to that, and then let the people involved get on with it without further meddling. Occasional accounting, but not micromanagement.
Thanks, Robin. And concluding his case against the motion, George Magnus.
Strangely, I wasn't going to mention this, but Robin just kind of spurred me to think about something that is, I think, fair game, because we've had a little bit of discussion this evening about, a lot of discussion about finance and about money and about QE and all that malarkey. And we have this kind of idea that we have to produce all this QE. Actually, the money doesn't go anywhere except inside the banking system. So, the problem about it is that we have this fixation that we can only use quantitative easing and use this tool to stimulate what we think will stimulate private spending and private lending. And actually, clearly it's not working because the private sector wants to save. It's going through that kind of a phase. Why we have this obsession that we can't use the same tool to basically take debt effectively straight off the government without increasing public debt and actually putting £50 billion into the banks to capitalize them and get them to lend again, which is kind of what we want, or why we can't use a certain amount of money to basically achieve what the coming governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, has called this escape velocity, which is, build some stuff, put people to work, and then, the private sector will take care of itself. I think these things will, could happen very easily. But I want to kind of conclude, really, by just pointing out, what, again, one of my gurus, John Maynard Keynes, basically identified as the central economic problem, which was to combine economic efficiency, social justice, and individual liberty. And I think that's been an evolving problem over the last 200 years or so, and will be for the next 150, 200 years, and we are going to make mistakes from time to time, as we have done in the 2000s to catastrophic effect, we know. But I'm pretty sure we'll sort it out. And, there are, as I tried to allude, coping mechanisms which will nurture and create to help us do this. But it will take time, and it's a very painful period.
Thanks, George. And for his final comments in favour of the motion, Tristram Hunt.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, you have all voted now, and I want to pay tribute to those of you who are on the right side of history. We've made the right decision tonight. To the others, we've given you a hint of a reading list. There's a very good biography of Engels available, if you want to pursue that further. I will also tell you that socialism is fun. Don't be worried. Embrace it. One of Engels' main concerns when he was living in Manchester in the 1850s was how to get the ingredients for lobster salad. He got them in the end. Listen, if you were part of a collective loss of £20 billion on a collective rice farm, you would probably begin to have some questions about the viability of Maoist socialism. You are currently part, in the UK, of a 20 billion collective loss on our shareholder-driven, laissez-faire, capitalist banking structure. That is the loss you're facing at the moment. So for those of you who said, things aren't working out quite as well as we hoped, for those of you who voted to say that Karl Marx might have a point, you are on the right side of the analysis. Because what we want ultimately to end up with is a more sensible system of wealth creation, which is where this discussion have been heading at the end. We want more producers and less predators. We want more cooperatives and we want less collateral debt obligations. And what we want to do, to go back to George's musings around Highgate Park, and always remember that Karl Marx is buried in the shadow of a mental asylum, is to stop the interpretation and to try to start to change the world. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tristram. And the final act of the evening falls to me to read out the results of the vote. To remind you, the motion for the last time, Karl Marx was right, capitalism post-2008 is falling apart under the weight of its own contradictions. Before the debate, those in favour of the motion numbered 203, those against were 214, and don't knows were 197. Many of those don't knows have now made up their minds, and the result at the end of the debate, for the motion, 217, against the motion, 316, and don't knows 37. So my thanks to Intelligence Squared for hosting the debate and to the speakers. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.